Welcome to the Early Steps and Next Steps seminar number 4. Our focus today is going to be struggling readers. Who are they and what do they need? Before we get started, site coordinators, I just want to remind you to get all this information to our wonderful Nikki Fellows at the University of Utah Reading Clinic. Attendance at all 5 seminars is required for your certification and university credit. So regardless of whether you're going for university credit or not, if you want to certify early next steps, you need to attend these seminars. And we need to have that information up at the clinic so that we can give you credit for that. Thank you. Researchers have been interested for a long time in struggling readers and who struggling readers are, why they have these struggles. And in the last 15 years, there have been some significant advances in our knowledge about who struggling readers are and where these difficulties stem from. We're going to be covering 2 particular studies today that I find, actually it's really several studies, but Valentino and his colleague Donna Scanlon and their other colleagues at SUNY Albany have done some exceptional work, as have Don Shankweiler and his colleagues, and these are 2 studies that I would encourage you to read if you ever have the opportunity. They provide some I think, excellent insight into who struggling readers are and the sources of their difficulties, and by extension, what we can do about it. Up till now, when you're talking about severe reading difficulties, okay, up to now, that has been defined by the use of a discrepancy formula. And you will have encountered this if you've ever worked with the special educators in your schools. This is the type of, they use assessments to try and identify whether or not there is indeed a discrepancy between the child's general cognitive ability and this particular content area, say reading or math. And that's what they use to qualify or not qualify a student for services. So let's explore that a little further. When someone has a disability, okay, a learning disability of some kind, the notion behind that is that they're of average intelligence. Okay, so think about who you're ruling out as I go here. You've got to have average intelligence at least. No physiological or emotional or psychological impairments. Okay, that rules out another whole group of students, okay? But at the same time, you have significant difficulty in a particular content area. When you're talking about reading, it would be significant difficulty in learning to read. Some kids have a specific math disability, okay? Now, how special educators establish that is by giving a series of tests, including a general sort of intelligence test, an overall IQ test, and then particular achievement tests in particular cognitive areas such as reading or math, trying to determine, is there indeed a discrepancy between the general cognitive ability of the child and this particular content area. If that discrepancy is found, typically by being a standard deviation and a half below their general cognitive ability. So let's say a child is right on, average, right on the mean with a standard score of 100 on IQ. Once you get below 85 on a reading achievement test, you've hit that discrepancy. Okay, by the same token, a child who has 85 in IQ and 85 here, there is no discrepancy. Okay, so the discrepancy and the need to establish a discrepancy has driven our notion of who has disability and who doesn't, okay, as well as who's entitled to services. Okay, now, typically when people thought about the discrepancy and why the discrepancy was there, the notion was that the difficulty, the problem, lay within the child, okay? Researchers refer to it as being constitutional in origin. In other words, there's something in the child that's glitchy, that causes, everything else is fine, but there's something in the child, there's a cognitive glitch that causes this difficulty in learning to read, okay? Could be genetic, as in the case, remember we talked when we were talking about phonological awareness, that it's often a familial deficit that's passed on genetically, okay? It could be something like that. So it could be a genetic constitutional limitation in the child, or it could be simply an organic constitutional limitation within the child where for some reason it's not genetic, it's not familial, but that child just has this glitch, a cognitive glitch that impacts negatively learning to read. Okay? But think about it for a second. You can't, if you just assume that the problem's in the child, okay, you've never really looked at that child's educational history. Now, when you look at the intervention research suggests that it sometimes isn't in the child. Now, obviously, sometimes there are problems in the child in the sense the child has some cognitive glitches, but you also have to explore the notion that there could be problems in the child's educational history, i.e., the child has not received good enough or enough of an amount of reading instruction. So there could be problems in reading instruction with the quality of it and or the quantity of the reading instruction. That could account for the discrepancy. So do you see what I'm saying here? In fact, the intervention research suggests that many of the struggling readers, at least some of the struggling readers that we're identifying with this discrepancy, are actually what Valentino calls curriculum casualties. There's nothing really wrong with their cognitive system. The fact of the matter is they've actually just not received good enough or enough of good quality reading instruction, and as a result, they lag behind, and there is a discrepancy. So if you want to think about it, you could actually put reading difficulties on a continuum, okay, from constitutional difficulties, constitutional deficits, where there is a cognitive glitch in the child's brain, okay? Now think about it as in the kid, okay? These are harder to fix if you're thinking about remediation, because there is something, you know, we can control the environment a lot more easily than we can control the child's brain and how it works, usually. Now, of course, these range from mild to moderate to severe as well. But constitutional limitations are typically more difficult to fix than, say, a deficit that's outside the child that we can manipulate totally. Okay? These are easier to fix because we can establish high quality instruction and enough of it. If you ever have read Sally Shaywitz's book, Overcoming Dyslexia, you'll see that when she talks about programs for kids who are individuals who are severely dyslexic, she talks about you want it to work, you want them to really make progress. For kids who are severely dyslexic, you're talking about 2 solid hours a day with a high quality intensive intervention. 2 solid hours plus homework. That's the amount of. But again, you can fix that. That is environmental. Okay? Okay, so Valentino and his colleagues asked this research question. They said, can we distinguish between kids whose reading difficulties are constitutional in origin, in the kid, in the child, and from those whose difficulties are more environmental in origin? In other words, kids whose cognitive machinery is just fine, they just haven't gotten enough, quality and quantity of good reading instruction. This answer has implications for the type and the duration of, I would add classroom instruction here as well as intervention. So Valentino and his colleagues went out and they found 1,400 students. These were primarily first graders, first and second graders. Initially first graders, and then the study went on for 2 years. In middle and upper middle class schools. And if you think, most people would think that's a detriment to the study. But if you think about it, it's really not a limitation, it's actually a strength of the study. Because what they've done is they ruled out other environmental influences that can significantly impact kids' reading achievement. For example, we know that kids who come from high poverty backgrounds have, in addition to reading instruction potentially negative factors, the fact that they come to school having had so few literacy experiences is another environmental factor. So what Valentino and his colleagues were hoping is that by working in middle and upper middle class schools, they would get more of a homogeneous population where kids came in with at least the basics. Okay, so then you can say, all right, it's a question of there's constitutional limitations, cognitive glitches in the child, or environmental glitches in the form of the curriculum. The measures on this, everything but the kitchen sink. Valentino must have had an army of graduate assistants because you name the test, they got it. Okay? The poor readers, they identified kids as strugglers in first grade, and they tutored them with this was going to look kind of familiar, with an intervention that was 30 minutes, one-on-one, daily, for 15 weeks, and then 8 to 10 additional weeks if they needed it. I can't imagine them not needing it. I mean, it's just not that much time. Donna Scanlon is trained in reading recovery, or at least very familiar with it, and the intervention looked a lot like reading recovery. Here are the results. Valentino and his colleagues found that certain things show up to distinguish among kids very early, because they tested these kids actually initially, I think, in mid-K or end of K. And they found that in kindergarten, you can actually distinguish between the, quote, normally achieving kids and the kids who are harder to fix, the kids who were just, the kids who needed more intervention. And you could distinguish between the easier to fix kids and the harder to fix kids by typically the same 3 factors over and over came up. And you will, this is not surprising when you think about some of our earlier seminars, nor some of the things that you've seen in working with kids. Phonological awareness distinguishes. Short-term memory and rapid naming abilities. These 3 factors show up over and over as distinguishing between, when you look at the group of kids who have difficulty, it distinguishes between the kids who have less difficulty and the kids who have more difficulty, and it also distinguishes between the kids who don't have any difficulty and the kids who have lots of difficulty. So to me that would mean, they don't distinguish between the kids who don't have difficulty and have just a little bit. So it's really more of a distinguishing factor for the kids with severe difficulties. We see kids in the clinic all the time with these issues, particularly when you think about rapid naming. I should probably explain that. Rapid naming would be, the task looks something like you would show someone a page and it would have, say, just pictures on it, like pig, cat, dog, horse, all mixed up, and pig, cat, dog, horse, and dog, pig, cat, horse, and horse, pig, cat, dog, in different, and they have to name the picture like cat, pig, dog, horse, pig, cat, as fast as you can. So it's the ability to recognize, identify something, and then retrieve the name out of memory. Rapid naming, okay. And so they want to rule reading out of it, so they use pictures. Some people would call this a measure of processing speed. And so the ability to do that quickly or not distinguishes, as does short-term memory. Short-term memory works like this. It's up to 15 seconds and then it degrades. So if I said to you, my phone number at home is 8432768. What is it? 8432768. Okay, so those are the, and so blah, 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 blah. What was my phone number?
8432768.
Well, we've got some people with really good short-term memory here. Anyway, if I had to rehearse something else, it would have been gone. Short-term memory degrades quickly. And so, for example, the child who's trying to sound this out, k, p, and then put it together to get cup, by the time they get to k, by the time they're at p, they've forgotten what they had here. Short-term memory is, so they'll come up with something like pat. They just remember that last one, okay? These abilities, okay, phonological awareness, short-term memory, and rapid naming deficits, these seem to be the constitutional deficits, okay, the ones that are inherited, the glitches that are in the child, okay? What Valentino and his colleagues also showed was that intervention can make a difference. After 2 years of tutoring, only 1.5% of the students fell below the 15th percentile in reading achievement, and only 3% fell below the 30th percentile. Now notice that this is fewer than the 9% estimates that we typically get when we don't take educational history into account. In other words, if you don't intervene early, you're going to end up with about 10% of the population manifesting the discrepancy. But if you intervene early, you end up with only 3% of the population below the 30th percentile, okay, and even fewer way down at the other end, okay? So, and what Valentino and his colleagues concluded from that is, in this population of the eventual 10% who, if they don't get any intervention, end up labeled specific learning disabilities, if you catch them earlier, they're not going to show up there. And with that in mind, if you catch them earlier, they don't show up there, then it wasn't constitutional, right? It was environmental. It was in the curriculum. You could fix it. So what's the take-home message for educators? One of them is, we can't assume that a child has a disability without trying some early intensive intervention. Some kids look very disabled early on, and it's it's primarily a question of lack of good curriculum. They are curriculum casualties. These constitutional deficits that do characterize, that are in the child and do result in very difficult to remediate reading difficulties, they show up early. You can usually spot them kindergarten or at least by early first grade. Another take-home message for educators from the Valentino study is that the discrepancy formula isn't enough. I mean, typically, certainly it's helpful in determining whether there is a discrepancy, but once you get that discrepancy established, then you need to know, where do I start with the child? What level do I start with? And so in that sense, more sensitive reading-related tasks and assessments are needed. And I think the most important take-home message is, from this study is that intervention, when provided early and in enough sufficient quantities, and I think coupled with high-quality classroom instruction, can significantly reduce what we call the learning disabled population. In that labeled group are a significant number of people who really don't have constitutional in-the-head problems. Okay. Now there are certainly people out there that have some of both, right? Curriculum casualties and some mild to moderate constitutional limitations. But early and intensive remediation, intervention can reduce that population. Okay, so let's move on to another study. The next study is by Shankweiler and his colleagues, and they asked some very interesting questions based on things that they had been hearing teachers say for years. Typically, if you talk to say, really any elementary school teacher, teachers in any of the elementary school grades, and you say, think about the kids in your class who struggle as readers. Would you say they're poor at both decoding and comprehension? Or would you say there's more of them that are poor at mostly comprehension, but they're pretty good at decoding? Or would you say they're mostly poor at decoding, but pretty good at comprehension? Where would you say the bulk of them lie? And typically what you're going to find is, and there is actually some data now that substantiate this claim, that teachers tend to say, I have some kids who are poor at both decoding and comprehension, but I also have a lot of kids who are good decoders, but terrible at not very good at comprehension. In other words, these are kids who can figure out any word, and they read pretty well, but they're not good at comprehension. Those are the kids that have been typically defined as, in the whole language literature, as word callers. Kids who can say the words, decode the words, but they can't construct meaning for the text, okay? Okay, so then another profile could be a child who is strong at comprehension because they've got this good background knowledge, they know lots of vocabulary, they have a lot of world knowledge, and so they fill it in. Even though they can't get the words, they're not very good at decoding, even though they can't identify the words, they fill in the gist and they get it. So do you see how these are opposites? These ones are good at decoding, bad at comprehension. These kids, good at comprehension, bad at decoding. And then the kids who are bad at both. Okay, Shankweiler and his colleagues were asking, if you sent out a call for lots and lots of kids struggling to read, are these profiles really there? And if so, which ones, and which ones are more prevalent than others? Are there mostly kids that are bad at both? Are most of the poor readers out there word callers? They know their phonics, but they can't understand? Are most of the kids out there background knowledge compensators? They're lousy at decoding, but they're so good at background, they fill it in and get the answers right anyway? Anecdotal evidence suggests that teachers tend to think there's a lot of these and a lot of these. That's where they put the bulk of kids. So let's see what the data suggests. Well, first, the methods for the study. Shankweiler and his colleagues set out a call for kids with learning problems. And as you can imagine, they were deluged at their university. They ended up selecting 361 kids ages 7.5 to 9.5 with IQs above a standard score of 80. Okay, so wide range of kids, but above a standard for intellectually handicapped. They again gave them quite a few measures: listening comprehension, reading comprehension, word identification, pseudo-word identification. Just so that you know, pseudo-word identification would be something like, you take nonsense words, words that aren't really words that but can be sounded out. For example, oh, I got one. How would you pronounce that? Fote. Okay, it's not a real word, but we know how to pronounce it based on the rules of the language. These are pseudo words, and this, the accuracy with which we say these is a measure of decoding ability. Okay, so Shankweiler and his colleagues gathered all this data on these kids, and then they plotted their composite reading scores on a scattergram. That means let's say that Matt had a decoding score of, let's say his decoding score was here, and his comprehension score, so his decoding score was here and his comprehension score was here, so this would be Matt. Well, so let's say that Grace had a decoding score that put her here and her comprehension score of here, this would be Grace. So they plotted kids based on their composite reading scores on what they call a scattergram. So what I'd like you to do is follow along and draw this with me. I want you to basically draw this scattergram out. Okay, so we're going to put down here reading comprehension, and up the side we're going to put decoding. And you're going to draw it into quadrants, because what we're looking for is people who are good at decoding, poor at comprehension, etc. Okay? So now what Shankweiler and, you're okay, go back to here. What Shankweiler and his colleagues did is they said, okay, for the kids who are, these kids are equally good at decoding and comprehension. Okay? In other words, they had high decoding scores and high comp scores. Okay? And he told us there are, let's see, 114 of these. Then he said there are all these kids in here. They're too close to call. We're not going to say that they're good or they're bad because they're too near the line. So they established a buffer zone. Okay? And in the buffer zone, there were 71 kids. Okay, so remember the overall N, let's see, the overall N is 361. Okay, now let's see what needs to fall in these other categories. Students over here are better at comprehension and worse at decoding, right? So fill this in just like I am here. What about these guys here? They're poor at both. They're equally poor at comprehension and decoding. These guys are equally good. These guys are equally poor because of where they fall. So what does that make these guys over here? These guys are better at decoding and worse at comprehension. So let's go back to this one here for just a sec. All right, so let's go back to our regular numbers, and then I'm going to have you guys do some predicting. Okay, so remember we've got 114 students that came out as average or above average readers. That was at 114 up in that high quadrant. We had 71 kids that they thought were too close to call. This is a strength of the study, right? They're saying, look, he's 1 point over the line. I'm not going to call him good. So they got rid of all those, or 1 point below. I'm not going to call them bad. They got rid of 71 kids out of their N for a buffer zone. And then the remaining kids who are poor readers fell into one of these three categories, fell into one of the other three categories. There were 127 in one category, 32 in another category, and 17 in another category. What I'd like you to do is figure out where do they fit. So you're going to take 127, 32, and 17, and you need to put those three numbers in one of these quadrants. Which one do you think it is? At 127, are there 127 kids who are better at comprehension than they are at decoding? Are there 127 kids that are better at decoding but worse at comprehension, or 127 kids that are equally poor at both? Go ahead and establish what you think, predict what you think, where things fell in terms of the data. Site coordinators, please pause the tape. Okay, and we're back. Well, the results show, I wonder if you'll find this surprising, we have 127 students. The bulk of the kids fell into a category that could be defined as they're not really terribly good at either decoding or comprehension. They're pretty much equally poor at both. Okay? Now, over here, in this quadrant, we had 32 students whose scores seemed to suggest that they were better at comprehension than they were at decoding. In other words, these are the kids, they can't decode very well, but they have an ability to kind of fill in what's happening in the story with their background knowledge. These are the background knowledge compensators. And, surprisingly enough, we had only 17 what you could call word callers. Kids who tended to be better at have better decoding skills than they did comprehension. So, and that's summarized right here on this page as well. Let's talk about what this means then and the implications it has for instruction. What's the take-home message for educators? The take-home message is this: most children are equally good or poor at both decoding and comprehension. If you remember, we had, in fact, it's 241 of the 361, 67% of that population is equally good or equally poor, approximately, at decoding or comprehension. Another thing that was very interesting that came out was when they ran correlations on which measure correlated with what, they found that, and remember these are kids who are poor readers, so they were probably reading anywhere on an average of, beginning first grade to early, maybe end of second at the best, okay? They found that the word skills, word identification and pseudo-word identification, correlated more strongly with reading comprehension than with listening comprehension, okay? In other words, the word skills more closely are more closely related to what's happening when you try to understand the text at these lower levels. So it drives the reading process quite heavily. Now let's talk about what the profiles are of the readers. There are a few, in fact 14% of the total population, 14% of that total population of kids they came in who have reading difficulties, there are a few of what you could call discrepant readers, kids who tend to be better at either decoding or comprehension. But there are very few word callers. In fact, only 10% of the poor readers, of the kids that fell into those three quadrants, only 17 of them total out of 176 kids in the poor reader quadrants, okay, were what you could call word callers. But this is important too. It's a stretch to label even these 17 word callers. Here's why. Think about what the term word caller implies. Word caller implies I'm really good at decoding and I'm lousy at comprehension. These kids aren't even really good at decoding. In fact, they're significant, well, I don't know if you can say significantly, they're lower on average than the good readers are at both. So you can't even really call them good decoders. They just happen to be better at decoding than they are at comprehending, but they're really not very good at either. I'm going to show you what they look like on the scattergram. And this will illustrate this point a little more clearly. Okay. Each of these little dots is a kid. Okay, and you can see you've got comprehension here, non-words, which is the pseudo-word task up here. So here are your kids that are good at both, right? They scored high on decoding, high on comprehension. So here's your quadrant where kids are good at both. Here's your quadrant where they're low on decoding, right? So I have a low, this is the cutoff. I have a low decoding score. I have a low comprehension score. I'm in here somewhere, okay? So these are the ones that are equally good or poor at both, right? Here are your kids who are better at comprehension because they come out further along here in their score, but they're not very good at decoding. So here's your 32 kids who are your background knowledge compensators. Here are your 17 kids who are better at decoding than they are at comprehension. But look at where they are on decoding. Now, one of these 17 is way up here where the other good decoders are. They're very close to the line. So they barely make it into the category of what you could call good decoding. So it's a stretch to even call them word callers because actually they're not terribly good at either. You can tell because they cluster so close here to the center of both cutoffs. So let's finish up with a couple of conclusions from the Shankweiler et al. Study. The vast majority of poor readers demonstrate deficits in decoding skills. If you go back and look at this scattergram, you'll find that if you take just the poor readers, the kids who come out poorly on either reading or decoding, either comprehension or decoding or both, okay, you get 176 kids. 159 of them, or 90%, had problems in decoding, okay? So high quality word recognition, and that seems to imply that high quality word recognition or decoding instruction is necessary in regular curriculum to prevent reading difficulties, and it's necessary for interventions for struggling readers, even for most of the so-called word callers. If you think about where they were in the scattergram, those decoding skills aren't terribly good. They're just barely above average for kids that are having trouble, okay? So even they could benefit from that. That's it. Stay tuned for number 5. Hi, I'm back. I forgot to tell you this. Let's go back to the anecdotal evidence where teachers tend to believe that their classrooms are populated with lots and lots of word callers. Oh, he's a great decoder, because I'll have teachers say, he's a great decoder, but he just can't do comprehension. What would account for teachers finding that or believing that? It's not like they're making it up. They think they're seeing a particular phenomenon. Actually, I believe the root of this anecdotal evidence that they think they've collected is the fact that they're watching the child decode, and the child is accurate. The child gets most of the words accurately. But if you looked at the reading rate for that child, or their ability to decode pseudo words, you would find that their rate is extremely slow. They're accurate, but they are slow. And in order to accord someone the title of good decoder, you have to be not only accurate, but fast, and within normally achieving levels of speed. Many of these kids can be accurate, but they're just very, very slow. And in that sense, you can't call them good decoders at all.